Hello, this lecture is on the American Revolution and Canada. The War of Independence that started with gunfire at Lexington and Concord in April 1775 was soon to involve Canada. The American Revolution that formally ended in 1783 had a major impact on Quebec and the Atlantic region. North of the American 13 colonies, military conflict between American and British forces was mostly isolated and brief, especially on the East Coast. Most French Canadians were ambivalent about the conflict, and less than 300 threw their support behind the Americans. The number of Nova Scotians directly involved in the conflict was even smaller. Despite the limited involvement of Canada in the fighting, the ultimate victory by the Americans over the British meant a very different Canada. Britain's massive North American empire was no more. After 1783, Canada would proceed in the shadow of an emerging powerhouse. There were several major reasons for American rebellion. One was the Quebec Act of 1774 that upset many Americans. The extension of the southern boundary of Quebec to the Ohio River blocked American westward movement. The mostly Protestant Americans argued that the Quebec Act was too tolerant of Roman Catholicism. The act confirmed to the Roman Catholic Church the right to hold, receive, and enjoy its accustomed dues and rights. The reintroduction of French civil law and the seigneurial system in Quebec were significant concessions by the British. Anything favorable for French Canadians was distressing to American political leaders. Thomas Jefferson and others used strong rhetoric pointing to British tyranny that limited American freedom. The Continental Congress denounced the Quebec Act for establishing the Roman Catholic religion, quote, abolishing the equitable system of English laws and erecting a tyranny there to the great danger of the neighboring British colonies, end of quote. As one historian put it, to the disordered imaginations of the American patriots, the northern province loomed up suddenly like a specter from some barbaric and vanished past. While the British government mishandled relations with American leaders, it did a commendable job treating French Canadians with sensitivity. The idea of French Canadian assimilation after the British conquest of New France was appealing, but the British soon realized they could never make English Protestants out of French Canadian Catholics. The Quebec Act and the civil treatment of French Canadians by Governor Guy Carleton won over important French Canadians, particularly the Roman Catholic clergy. Carleton understood how important it was for French Canadians to conserve their faith, language, and legal system. At the very least, the Quebec Act discouraged any serious challenge to British rule on the St. Lawrence River. Political stability mattered because Americans planned to invade Quebec. Noting that Quebec had the greatest store of munitions ever assembled in America, General George Washington stated that it was, quote, folly not to do all possible to capture it. Quebec and Nova Scotia in British hands was too serious a threat to the rebelling colonies. Besides, American leaders convinced themselves that the French Canadians, suffering under the burden of British tyranny, were ripe for liberation from their oppressors. Before war broke out, Governor Carleton wisely expected France to support the Americans. In 1775, two American armies marched north from the breakaway colonies. Hoping to persuade the French Canadians to join their cause and push the British out of North America. One army traveled up the Richelieu River to Montreal, where it took control of the city. The Americans almost captured Governor Carleton, who was in Montreal to supervise the city's defense. Disguised as a civilian, he escaped and returned to Quebec. Another army, led by General Benedict Arnold, who 5 years later deserted to the British, traveled across swamps, over icy rivers, through the dense forests of Maine towards Quebec. In November 1775, people living in the Quebec area awoke to find the Americans camped outside the fortress walls of Quebec. The Americans, weak and tired from their difficult route, announced to the French that they'd come to restore liberty to, quote, our brethren of Canada. To the surprise of Arnold, only a small number of French were supportive of the American cause. While they had no great love for the British, they were less sympathetic of their former enemies of the South. Most French Canadians were content to do nothing and wait and see what unfolded. Although some sold their supplies to the Americans for cash, this ended when the Americans were unable to pay for the transactions with cash. The seigneurs and the clergy, not forgetting British concessions to them, continued to support the British. Over 500 French Canadian militia fought to defend Quebec against the Americans. But there were limitations to their support. They refused to join a British attack on the American colonies. The task of the American invading force was made more difficult due to harsh winter conditions. The American soldiers grew restless, huddled in their flimsy tents in the freezing winter. The thick stone wall of the Quebec fortress was a formidable obstacle. The Americans poured cannon fire into the walled town, but they did little damage. In desperation, they attempted one final assault on December 31st. During a blinding snowstorm, the Americans hoped to overrun the town. Confronting a group of French militiamen who opened fire, the men panicked and fled while another group got lost in the winding streets, with defenders firing on them from stone walls. The American general, Richard Montgomery, died by gunshot. Many Americans and French Canadian supporters were captured. Carleton's generous treatment of the captured French Canadians resulted in improved relations with the French Canadian people. The Americans continued to have a miserable winter, settling in behind fortifications made of ice and snow to carry on the siege. Badly short of supplies, the Americans resorted to forcible requisitions, but this generated hostility from the neutral French. The little support they had among the French Canadians diminished. When the British Army arrived with 10,000 soldiers in May of 1776, the Americans retreated to Montreal. At this point, they shelved their goal of conquering Canada. They only wanted to save their invading army. In time, the Americans left the St. Lawrence region altogether. The War of Independence in the American colonies was still in doubt, but it appeared that there would be no military conquest of Quebec. On the East Coast, Nova Scotia pretty much stayed quiet through all the pre-revolutionary agitation, except there were a few skirmishes. The old tradition of the Acadians was neutrality. Certainly, the situation in Nova Scotia differed from what occurred in Quebec. However, the outcome was the same. there was little support for the Americans. No large-scale military action by the Americans was played out in Nova Scotia. Halifax was a major military and naval base with strong connections to imperial authority. Its leading merchants and officials were firmly tied to the imperial interests. Both the Acadians and regional Indians showed no desire to be involved in the Civil War. Although revolutionary activity in Nova Scotia was somewhat muted, the further one traveled from Halifax, the greater the chance of finding enthusiasm for the American cause. Of the few minor conflicts, the more notable was led by New England settler Jonathan Eddy, who launched an invasion of Nova Scotia with a force of 72 men, joined by approximately 100 men from Cumberland County. Eddy laid siege to Fort Cumberland, the former Fort Beauséjour. According to one historian, both the siege and the defense were conducted with more sound than fury, and after 3 weeks in the comic opera episode, was ended by the arrival of a small relieving force. This event was the nearest thing to invasion or rebellion experienced by the province. It is understandable that the Acadians did not want to fight or that natives stayed clear of the conflict. In the case of Indians, the British in recent years had repaired its relations with them. They utilized the French technique of gift diplomacy to secure good relations. But what about Americans who had migrated to Nova Scotia in recent years? Generally, New Englanders showed little interest to be involved in the Revolutionary War. They were not only busy establishing a new life in Nova Scotia, but Christian evangelism may have played a role in their neutrality. Historian George Rawlik argued that a religious revival led by Henry Alline swept through the land and aroused far more interest than the war. Alline, an American evangelist, worked nonstop from 1776 to 1783 to create and sustain a religious movement known as the New Light Movement. This movement filled a spiritual vacuum in the new settlements far away from the revolutionary conflict. According to historians, he convinced many Nova Scotians that they were performing a special role, bringing the world back to God, and that Christ merited their allegiance, not the British or the revolutionaries. Political neutrality was the choice of these communities. They were more focused on perfecting their spiritual condition than on fighting in a worldly revolution. Although the Americans had ceased to conquer Canada, the British believed they could strike a mortal blow against the revolution by attacking New York from Quebec. They attempted to do this in 1777, but the British were defeated at Saratoga, north of Albany, by a much larger American force. This was the last large-scale expedition by the British from Quebec. In 1778, France joined the American colonies to defeat the British. Effective was the propaganda of Benjamin Franklin, setting up a printing press at his Paris residence. Franklin played a major role in enticing France to go to war. France's participation included a secret clause that France would not invade Canada. The Americans did not want to see New France restored in the future, and France did not want to see an American conquest of Canada. As for Canadian involvement for the balance of the war, there was only supply raiding parties into New York, Pennsylvania, and down the Mississippi River. Native involvement in the conflict went from neutrality to open warfare. An attack on the Six Nations by General John Sullivan in 1779 provoked the Iroquois to retaliate and burn crops and destroy villages between the Ohio and Mohawk rivers. After the American Revolution, the British gave the Iroquois land in today's southern Ontario. To conclude, the American victory had a major impact on Canada. Quebec, Nova Scotia, and territory in the Northwest became Britain's only North American possessions. From this point on, the development of Canada took place in the shadow of a rising nation with powerful ideas of democracy, liberty, and economic growth. Thank you.